On the 18th of July 1943, 8 men walked to the gallows inside of a square in Krasnodar for their executions. The executioners placed the nooses around their necks and then stepped back, but what had these men done? During the Second World War, there were many people who defected over to their enemies or collaborated with them. Some of these collaborations led to executions of innocent people or deportations of thousands to concentration camps. Some women would even sleep with the Germans, and this was then punished by a horrific ordeal known as the Ugly Carnival, in which they would have their heads shaved and were forced to run the gauntlet, surrounded by the angry French population. But inside of the Soviet Union, there were some people who did collaborate with the Germans following the invasion of their lands, and these people were dealt with brutally. These men were accused of the ultimate crime in the Soviet Union, treason, and supporting the invading German armies, who would slaughter, execute and pillage wherever they went. Join us today as we look at the brutal executions of the Soviet traitors, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. When the Second World War erupted in Europe, to begin with it looked as if the Soviet Red Army and the German Army would not fight each other. Non-aggression pacts were signed between the two nations, and this surprised the world, especially with the fact Hitler quite obviously wanted to rampage to the east, and he wanted to make living space for the Germans inside Soviet-occupied lands. But following the invasion of Poland and the country being carved up between the two, murmurings were heard that one day Hitler would break the treaty and that the peace between the two huge powers would be broken. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched, and this was the largest land offensive in history, as over 10 million combatants took part. The Nazis wanted to destroy the communists, and they would, during the operation, cause chaos across the Soviet Union and in different lands. The Nazis had been building for an invasion for around a year, and the force that invaded the Soviet Union was propped up by 600,000 vehicles and hundreds of thousands of horses. What happened though opened up the Eastern Front, and during the conflict there would be a huge amount of bloodshed in the area, as the Eastern Front saw some of the most ferocious fighting in history. The cost to both militaries was huge, but there was also a huge cost to civilian life. After the German army would rampage into different lands and seize villages and settlements, then the Einsatzgruppe, an SS paramilitary death squad, would follow, and they would slaughter the civilians. Millions were killed in these attacks, and they would round up civilians and then force them to dig their own graves before they were marched in them, and they would be shot dead. Still today, huge atrocities carried out by the Einsatzgruppe remain uncovered, and thousands of victims remain under the soil. But there was looting that happened everywhere also, and a huge amount of burning of houses, villages and whole areas, which were then razed to the ground. There was a lot of assault committed upon Soviet women by the Germans, and there were even gassings carried out in areas. The Germans also systematically starved to death 3.3 million Soviet prisoners and millions of civilians in the hunger plan, and the plan was to exterminate large elements of the population without having to fire a single bullet. But throughout the onslaught, Stalin was hugely concerned, as the power of the German army would push the Red Army back heavily, and it looked at some point as if the whole of the Soviet lands would fall. But Barbarossa would fail, following the horrors of Stalingrad and the reversal of the fortunes of the Soviet Red Army. But to those soldiers who fought in some of the most brutal battles, they had witnessed some of the worst things. But as the Germans occupied different areas, towns and cities, they would establish brutal regimes in which persecution would occur, and mass executions and killings would take place. Things were incredibly tough for the Soviets living under occupation, but some people would make their lives easier and collaborate and work with the Nazis and the Germans, and they would conduct a number of different roles for them. Some would literally become Jew hunters, people who were paid and given food to hunt Jews to then be arrested and executed, or they were then deported to concentration camps. Inside of the city of Krasnodar, there were a number of people who were collaborating with the Nazis, but some would pay the ultimate price for their treason. The Germans, during their occupation of the city, would depend on local people, and they would enlist the help of the local government, policemen and elders. Soviet citizens then became involved in the crimes of the Germans, but there were many others who would encounter the Germans through their jobs, for example farmers. But these people were then seen as collaborators, and later the Soviets would want to inflict punishment and retribution onto anyone who was involved in helping the Germans in any form during the occupations of towns and cities. Authorities would try to punish locals who worked with the Germans, and they would search for traitors who had not been loyal to Stalin during the war. In Krasnodar there was a war crimes trial that was held in July 1943 inside of the city regarding a group of men who had been accused of collaborating with the Germans. These were men who had been involved in helping the Germans throughout the occupation of the city. Krasnodar was occupied by German army groups between the 12th of August 1942 and February 1943, and despite the occupation being around 6 months long, there was a huge amount of suffering in the city. The Einsatzgruppen death squads would arrive in the area and they would slaughter 7,000 civilians. These victims were made up of Jews and communists, and the occupation forces would use terror to keep the population in line. There was mass shootings carried out in public, and also burnings of homes, and people were executed by hanging in front of crowds, and their remains were left out for days to send a clear, harrowing message. There were even gas vans brought to the city, but the Germans in Krasnodar would need a number of locals to help them and to aid with their slaughter. Once the Germans had left, the authorities then sought to find those who had collaborated, and brought forward were 11 defendants, all of them men, who were said to have been collaborators, and they were Russian and Ukrainian. They were accused of helping the German army, SS and the police in their actions, and they were all accused of being involved in the murders of 7,000 people. But what made these collaborators particularly horrific in their actions was that all of them except for one had joined the Sonderkommando 10A, and this was a sub-detachment of the Einsatzgruppe D, who would execute a massacre around the city. This meant that these men were pivotal to the executions of the Einsatzgruppe, as they would perform different roles such as sorting through clothes which people had left when they arrived at their death sites, or they would be involved in even shepherding and driving people to their execution sites and the execution pits before they were then shot. Also, the Sonderkommando would be tasked with cleaning up after the atrocities, and they would cover up the mass graves or burn bodies inside of local crematoriums. These were men who were often forced to collaborate, but many also chose to do it to avoid persecution themselves, but some members would be executed to cover up the German crimes. But at the Krasnodar trial, Richard Ruff, the commander of the German 17th Army and the head of the local Gestapo, along with 13 other SS officials, were charged in absentia. The Soviet defendants were Vasily Tushenko, Ivan Oreshlakov, Mikhail Lastovina, Grigory Tushkov, Nikolai Pushkarev, Grigory Misan, Yunus Snapskok, Ivan Komarsev, Vasily Pavlov, Ivan Paramanov, and Igansy Kladov. 3 of the men were sentenced to 20 years hard labour, but 8 of them were sentenced to death. Their death sentence was declared on the 17th of July 1943, but the Soviet officials would waste no time in executing those collaborators, as they would be executed the very next day. Following spending the night in prison, the men were then taken to the Krasnodar town square for their execution. Here a large set of gallows had been made, and there were actually 3 separate gallows which would be used for the hangings. At 1 o'clock the men arrived at the foot of the execution device, and there was no scaffold, just a stool and a rope which was tied around the gallows. One by one the rope was secured around their necks, and a placard was placed over their chests that read "Traitor." Following the reading out of the death sentence, as a 30,000 strong crowd watched on, including children, the stools were kicked out from under the traitors' feet, and they were then left hanging. One journalist said of the executions, "It was like a signal of the approaching day of reckoning, a stern reminder to those Russians in the occupied regions who still cooperate with the Gestapo. The executions of the traitors was a harbinger of what awaited their German masters." The executions of the traitors of Krasnodar had a profound effect on the Soviet population, as it was heavily publicised, and it was hoped by Stalin that actions like this would prevent further collaboration with his enemies.